All right, so for the warm up here, we're going to talk about basically all the main stuff we've been talking about the last couple of days. This is your different kinds of intervals. So this wants you to find domain, range, positive, negative, increasing, decreasing intervals from this whole graph here. Before we get into any of that, things to pay attention to, you do have an open circle here, which means this point is not included. You got a closed circle here, which means this point is included. So we're going to have to take that into account when we answer these things. So let's just go down the line here. Domain, that's your x values. Specifically, left to right, how far does this graph go? So the furthest left it goes is -3. The furthest right it goes is 1. So it's going to be from -3 to 1. Now we have to put the correct symbols on there. Since this point is not included, you use a parenthesis. This point is included, we use a bracket. So that's what our domain should look like. Range, same exact concept, except range is up and down. So how high and how low. So start with how low. The lowest point this graph ever reaches is -4, and the highest point it reaches is 0. So we're going to go -4 to 0. The -4 point is included. It's actually included twice, so that's definitely a bracket. Now 0 is a tricky one. It's not included there, but it is included here because it's on the line. So the 0 actually should have a bracket on it because of it. Because if it's included somewhere, but not here, it still is included at least once, which means it is part of the graph. Okay, so again, range is the only time that we care about y values. Every single other interval is going to be some x to some x. So as we think about all these, every one of these, we are concerned about x values when we go to write them. All right, positive. This is an easy one. This graph is never positive. Positive means it's above the x-axis. It never is, so there is no interval here. So you can write none, you can write never, you can write anything along those lines to indicate that this graph is never positive. Now, when is it negative? Okay, this part's negative. Here it's at 0. 0 is not positive or negative, so it's technically not negative right there, but then it is again. So we actually do need to answer this as two separate intervals. So it's negative from -3 to 0 and from 0 to 1. And so you might look at that and be like, well, 0's in there twice. Like, why do I have to do that? It's because at 0 specifically, the graph is not negative. It's a 0 at that point. So that's why it's technically is two separate little negative intervals. The last two on here, increasing and decreasing. Increasing means it has a positive slope. Decreasing means it has a negative slope. I like to do this just reading the graph left to right. So this graph starts off decreasing. It's heading downward, heading downward, heading downward, till it gets to right here. So that's a decreasing interval. That would be from -3 to -2. This graph decreases. So I'm going to write that, -3 to -2. And again, with these, we always use parentheses because at this point, it's no longer increasing or decreasing. It's just stopped. It's constant at that spot. Okay, then it goes and it increases for a while. So till it gets to here. So that'd be from -2 to 0. So when the graph increases. And then it switches back to decreasing. So from 0 all the way down to here. So from 0 to 1, the graph is decreasing again. And there we go. So that's a perfect example of all the types of intervals that we should be able to identify at this point. Any questions about any of those 6 things there? You'll pretty much never have to worry about brackets on these 4. So positive, negative, increasing, decreasing. You're pretty much never going to run into brackets. There's some really weird cases where you might, but for most everything you're going to look at, you won't. You do have to worry about brackets on domain and range, though, for sure, because that's where your open and closed intervals are going to matter. One thing I put on here also, this was something from, came up in the assignment that quite a few people asked me about. This is an Algebra 1 concept. When it says something like, what is f of -2? Remember, this is an input. This is saying, when you put in -2, what do you get out? Inputs are your x's. So in other words, when x is -2, what's the corresponding y value? Just go look at the graph. So at -2, the corresponding y value would be -4. So the answer there would be -4. And so that style of question is actually real simple. They could give you other things. What if the question was, what's f of 1? They said, what's f of 1? You'd say, okay, when x is 1, oh, guess what? It's also still -4. That just happens to be a coincidence there. So that's what that means. When they say, what's f of something, they're saying, hey, for this x value, what do you get out of the function? All righty.